Hello,
Good morning.
Anthony. How are you?
Yeah, how you been?
Um, it's hard to remember what I was like before this moment because I'm so happy now. It's effacing all past experience on the runway of my life. Thank you so much for meeting a little earlier than expected. I'm wondering, Anthony, how would you like to proceed? Would you mind maybe sharing your commentary, and then I have a few slides, but I would love to be able to react to your thinking on the film.
Sure thing. Yeah, we'll do is if we're filed in, if we could close the door. I know that's going to get stagnant here. It's everybody.
Okay,
Uh,
team is just talking about patients.
I know, but it sounds like they have to round.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't want to say it's only the blue team. It's anybody who can make it.
Okay.
But blue team has to make. If that's your question. All right. So we have two classes that are actually remote. We're joined not only by the School of Arts and Sciences at Rutgers, but also a college at Texas Tech University. So I think their preference is for us to kick things off. So the focus is on the movie that was selected, Gonjiam, and for us to actually provide the initial commentary. So for those that were able to watch this film, what were your initial thoughts on what this movie is really about? What came to your attention? I'm going to ask you to have to speak up. That's why I don't want the doors closed, because again, Texas has to hear you, right? Lubbock is waiting. So
I wonder if it's related to like how patients are being maybe like experimented on, and then is that how they die? I wasn't sure about it, but it seems like they were very angry and there's like a lot of negative energy there.
right. So I think that's certainly certainly something to pick on rather quickly. So if you couldn't hear, the idea here was that this particular asylum / psychiatric facility has a history. And entering into this facility 2017, 2019, you enter into a facility that has some memories. Now, I don't want to go off on a tangent this quickly, but that is The Shining, right? Whether it's a hotel, whether it's a hospital, these places tend to shine and bring the history with them. And that's certainly sticking with the supernatural element. Certainly looking at this through the lens of a psychiatrist, it also offers a history of our field and what treatments were back 1 decade ago versus 50 years ago versus the last century. And looking at it through the lens of 2023, we might draw the conclusion that, boy, that seemed barbaric. But remember that the technology of the times were the technology of the times, and people who actually employed these strategies didn't think. They were treating or mistreating people or patients, right? So that's a perspective to take here as well. And we can get into some of those more specifically, but that's certainly part of the conversation here, right? Any other initial observations?
I felt like there was also the cultural piece of Charlotte being like not from Korea, still being part of this group, and then her kind of being singled out in the end.
How was she singled out at the end?
And I feel like a lot of focus on her in a lot of ways that wasn't on the other two female characters even.
I tell you what, and this is where I'm going to make a comment, and then I'm going to then segue to the folks in Lubbock, because I'd love to hear your perspective on this. That is not necessarily tainted by medicine or psychiatry. Given the cultural element of this film and how Charlotte appears to have been treated differently, it would have been interesting if the writer-director instead had chosen for her to remain grounded and not have experienced this as a supernatural event, and what that would have meant. Because if that, then all of a sudden we have a conversation about culturally bound phenomenon, where individuals from a particular culture might feel or experience something where someone outside of that culture wouldn't understand it. And perhaps in Charlotte's case, in the rewrite, she wouldn't have experienced it. That would have been an interesting conversation to have, right? And again, there's other films. I mean, The Skeleton Key, really
Mhm.
focuses on this, right? Well, again, not to tangentialize, but the skeleton key is one of the kind of a hidden gem that really focuses on that very process. By the way, the main character happens to be a nurse from Hoboken who uproots and gets a job in the bayou region of the country, Louisiana, where root work, hoodoo, is culturally sanctioned. From Hoboken, she's never heard of this before. And the movie is her evolution and understanding what's going on. And I mean, I wonder if Charlotte would have been in a similar situation in terms of what that would have meant. So I want to briefly pause and ask the folks back in Lubbock about Charlotte and your take on that.
I love that observation about Charlotte because I think for me it's I don't know if this I'll be curious if this resonates with the group, Anthony, and yourself. But I think what's so interesting about Charlotte is to your point, to the point that was made, she is marked as culturally distinct, part of the Korean diaspora as a Korean American. And I found myself really intrigued by the way in which Charlotte was marked as different, even via the way in which she was negotiating Korean history. Do you all remember that moment where she has to be explained that the president, then current president, was the past was the child of a past president? And there's a lot of sort of winks throughout the film to the traumas of Korean history. I was thinking about like the March 10th, 2017. This is per my an article I found. The date that the two high school students visiting Gonjiam hospital and got lost is the date that former President Park Geun-hye was impeached. The hospital opened on May 16, 61, the day Park Chung-hee, South Korean dictator, and as we know, Park Geun-hye's father, staged his coup d'etat. The facility was closed on October 26, 1939, the day of his assassination. The framed photos of the wall show the hospital director with that then president, and even the dead chicken may remind the audience of the then current president, or the president who was impeached, because Korean citizens despairingly called her a chicken. So the director has said that he seeded these moments to trigger audience emotion. And so I think when we're looking at a character like Charlotte, I think this creates a sense of uncanny estrangement in the movie. If the uncanny via Freud is the familiar defamiliarized, here we have an entity, Anthony, I'll be curious if this resonates, who is making well-known Korean history into something estranging and unknown. And like, what? And even because all of these dates would resonate with a good portion of the audience, especially I think a lot of the contemporary stuff. But for Charlotte, she's just unaware, and I think that both marks her outside the group, creating a sense of insularity and isolation, and at the same time shows something that's recognizably Korean as something that from the American eye is meaningless. And I think that creates a further sense of lost psychological bearings.
I think too, like, she kind of ends up being a little voyeuristic, right? She talked about how she like went to two other disciple moments, especially the ones that don't talk to like a tourist almost. And it's like she was a tourist or a voyeur in her own culture and knowledge too.
It's like a tourist, and I don't know if you heard that, but it almost sets Charlotte up to be a tourist than even a voyeur within her own culture. Again, this is a film I think it demands a rewatch. This is one that I don't think you watch once and think, all right, well, I've seen it. This is a really good movie. And if you believe me and were to take me up on that, I would really be interested in getting your feedback and having watched this as a double feature with the Skeleton King, because it's the exact same thing, albeit within the United States. And we talk about not a class of cultures, but a subculture. Again, the bayou region of the United States, because that American meaninglessness is actually protected in the Skeleton Key, where here Charlotte is not protected by her ignorance, or lack of a better word, right? She's not protected by that sense of meaningless. She's just as victimized, and perhaps even more harshly, as a result of that. So similar type and definitely a shared type of dynamic, but with absolutely different outcomes. We'll be out here by 12.
The catering.
Oh. Gotcha. All right, we're gonna have to change rooms. You're gonna have to bear with us
Of
for
course.
literally 3 minutes.
No worries, no
Okay.
worries.
Right.
I'll ponder what you all have said.
Yep.
For those who are in the room while they're doing the move, um, I was just curious, how did you all make sense of the fact that he sees himself? This is what happens? I kind of didn't missed it. Does he see himself at the end? Do you remember the captain? He looks out the window. Did you all track who? 'Cause the movie was subtle, but he sees someone filming it. and I remember like wondering, did you all catch who he was? Was that him?
Honestly, I think I kind of like miss the subtleness of that part, to be honest.
Mm, yeah, it's a weird thing because I remember thinking to myself, there's a shot since we'll just sneak peek since we're all here. But I wanted to show you all the shot and get everyone's perspective on this. Let me see. Do you see that image on screen, everyone?
Not yet.
Okay, let's see.
There you go.
I-
Yep.
I was wondering, Anthony, with everyone that was in the room, this was very parenthetical, and I don't mean to disrupt the flow since we're talking about Charlotte, but it did strike me that I was thinking, like, does the captain see himself at the end, through the window? And if indeed the case, I think the film does a nice job of setting that up via the kind of like much more innocuous, like setting up the norm part of the horror movie, where they're friends. And I just was very struck by this particular image. It's even though it's a found footage movie, Anthony, I think it's very well composed, like or very very kind of formally uh aware and meticulous. And so I was just curious what you and our classes thought about this particular moment, and also what does it mean at the end that when you're experiencing a kind of psychic trauma, you feel yourself broken in that point, or you maybe not broken is all right, or maybe cleaved or split into two. And I didn't quite know, given that with the psychiatry expertise with yourself and everyone in the room, if that is in some ways a kind of allegorization of a traumatic response, that the split of the subject.
Yeah, I think the easy answer is potentially, and that is yes, definitely in terms of traumatic response, but you could even see this response that is more of the natural response outside of trauma. So this is very straightforward hypothalamic functioning. It's the fear response, not necessarily the traumatic response, because as there are different degrees of hypothalamic responsiveness. One might actually be dissociation, and that feeling of being detached from oneself. Yep. Yeah. And it doesn't necessarily have to, I mean, we're using the fear response as but an example. You could see these in relatively general anxiety states. And even though it's thought of in severe cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, the DSM, the American Psychiatric Association, has included both depersonalization and derealization as qualifiers of PTSD as recently as 2013.
You can also see it like in panic disorder sometimes too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's actually written in the diagnostic criteria, not even as a qualifier, but it's a diagnostic criteria of panic disorder as well. So people can actually experience these during panic attacks. So basically heightened anxiety, generally speaking, whether that anxiety really reaches the threshold of a particular anxiety disorder, with certainly PTSD and panic being very high in that differential. And then even in more severe cases, dissociation as hypothalamic function to stress in general or even trauma. Yep.
That yeah, I mean, I think for me like that, I think because you sharply identified, and I know from your Reddit commentary as well that there is, that it is very crucial that this is set in the hospital, and as someone said earlier, the move in this film seems to be, at least for some of our characters, seems to be going from oglers, and the kind of the hegemonic norm, even if it's a cruel and callous hegemonic norm, they're not hospital patients, to experiencing the position of the patient and experiencing that sense of, I think it seems like he's even strapped in the wheelchair. And I think so this movie, which is in some ways, as you're saying, about derealization, depersonalization, I'm curious how we can productively bring that language of trauma to make sense of a move this movie seems to be staging, not only an encounter with a kind of taboo history in the form of, the military dictatorship of South Korea, the various kind of cultural traumas associated with the state. Remember, everyone, that when they go into the hospital or they arrive in the hospital, what is the first thing we hear? It's not a scary bird or anything like that. It's a police siren. And so we have this movie that's very much kind of skeptical of the states and states complicity. Apparently, I read in that piece, Anthony and everyone, I read that the director had kind of subtly put in language about the new president's impeachment into the film, and he worried that might be too political, and he did worry, even in democratic South Korea, that he might be banned or censored because of this. But it's also sort of we have this state, but then we also have this parallel critique that's going on, which is, how do we encounter not only taboo histories via horror, but how are we encountering marginalized subject positions? And how do we move from being a part of a hegemonic center into a kind of forgotten masses of a patient within an uncaring institution? So I'm just curious, Anthony. I'm sure we all have many questions and thoughts, but in the spirit of this depersonalization, derealization, how does the language of trauma and that process of disassociation allow us a vocabulary to understand the transformation that so many of the characters seem to take, going from oglers, non-patients, into that much more powerless patient position?
Yeah, I wonder if the answer lies in empathy. So, I mean, you have this group enter into a hospital. This hospital has a history. And if you're empathetic and actually experience from other people's perspectives, boy, might you be vulnerable in such a hospital as to begin to have such symptoms as those that would result from a hyperactive hypothalamic gland. If an individual, on the contrary, were not empathetic and didn't connect and didn't automatically or subconsciously see things through other people's perspectives. Again, ironically, while that's horrible when it comes to bedside manner for any physician, it might have actually been a protective mechanism for these youth. So I wonder if it starts with ideas of empathy and the extent to which that the individuals who were in that hospital and their experiences directly impacted the experiences of those that visit the hospital, albeit years later.
Do you think in some ways, like, this is in some ways the patient subject position, like, as it's presented here, is this, because it seems to your point, it almost seems like, until you said it, I was like, oh wait, it almost feels like this movie is an uncanny invitation to feel empathy. It's asking our friends, listen, we've suffered. We are part of a forgotten history. We're a forgotten part of the populace, and now we want you to feel me, or feel everything that we've gone through. Because I think that I'm curious too. That is existing, this question of empathy, it seems, and tainted empathy. What do you make, Anthony, and everyone, about the very bloodthirstiness of the crowd? Something that's so fun about this movie and unsettling and implicating is, as the scares go up, so do the numbers, so do the views, you know. Like, and you know what I mean? Like, you know, we're constantly reminded this movie is so good at giving us different points of view onto the scares. So basically, the equivalent would be, you mentioned The Shining. Like, what if we cut, you know, the moment where Jack Nicholson's breaking down the door one day, you know, and all that jazz, and he's breaking down the door. The equivalent would be to like cut to some neighbor next door, you know, like across, you know, next to the Overlook Hotel. Like, this movie really enjoys, like, there's a moment of horror, and then they cut to two of them working on the door. You remember? And one of them says, "What's going on over there?" Because you can hear them scream, and then they go, "Are they being attacked by pirates or something?" And like, so for me, like, this movie is very much about divergent experiences of horror. And that is intermingled with where some people feel it and some people don't. And that, I think, is tainted by the fact that the crowd seems to want suffering. How do you understand, in this framework of empathy that you've described, how do you understand, Anthony, the presence, the divergent experiences of trauma versus no, or horror versus no horror at all, and maybe more particularly, the fact that this seems to be feeding a kind of appetite?
Yeah. So, you know, I think when you discuss empathy in this context, and especially as it relates to found footage movies, it automatically forces you to become that voyeur. I think that's a big reason why any found footage movie is so successful. That, you know, there's a substantial number of people, audience members, who go to a film and immerse themselves into the film subconsciously. The defense mechanism, identification. So they have empathy, and they usually connect to a victim, especially in horror. Well, found footage takes that to the next level, because you're actually watching something that was videotaped. So you become that voyeur, and that puts us in a position to ask ourselves the question, all right, so if we cortically are thinking about all of those hits, all of those likes being asocial, maybe antisocial, what does that say about me? Because here I am, and it's minute 43 of this movie, and I haven't moved from my seat yet. I'm just as into this movie as I was when I first turned it on. And that puts me in the exact same position as someone who'll be watching this live, because basically what I'm doing, that's where found footage brings you. So it does get down to empathy. And I really do think that while empathy can play a major role in films in general, found footage subgenre provides us just another level, and almost equitable to a person who will be watching this live and liking it with all those hits. So that's where I think this goes. Any thoughts?
Yeah, there's not like the idea of psychological distance, right? Of like there's like a distance between the camera and you, a distance between you and the computer, that allows you to enjoy it in a way that you wouldn't if you were in it, right? And you kind of see that transition for them from voyeur to victim really quickly. And I think that's kind of what this is posing, that like it's not a far jump from voyeur to victim.
So if you, I don't know if you were able to hear, but we talked about psychological distance and how that provides a barrier for you to continue watching it, but not necessarily fully experience it. Of course, like someone who was actually there recording it, or unfortunately being recorded, would actually meet. And we talk about this all the time, because this question often comes up with any of us watching these films, saying, why do they continue to hold the camera? Like, I mean, Cloverfield, I mean, Blair Witch, why don't they just drop the camera and run? And the answer is always psychological distance, that there's some barrier, perceived barrier, in holding that camcorder, holding that iPhone, holding that camera, that really positions the person who was there in real time with the viewer, hence making one and the same, hence empathy.
How do you understand? I love all this. And to the person that raised that question, I heard the line, "Not a far jump from a voyeur to victim." And, you know, thinking about, you know, why do they continue to hold the camera? It's a moment of psychological distance. I think one of the most delicious and unsettling parts of this movie is that by the end, do you remember when they're in darkness? And the only way they can see is like by bringing the camera up to their face. And so it creates, I think, a wonderful overturning, Anthony, of what you're describing, which is, yes, the the camera as distance. Remember, as this movie comes to a close, I was curious what you all thought about the fact that many of the cameras break down, and maybe for our great note on distance here, the drone camera falls, and the drone camera, which by the way, for your Shining reference, I think there's a really clear Shining reference when they up the drone camera and then they follow the car, through the forest a little bit. And so, but here, once the found footage comes, the full horror of found footage, our distancing camera, which evokes a kind of classic horror in the form of The Shining, falls to the ground. And then we're back into that horrible hospital. I'm sure Robert Wood Johnson Medical School isn't scary at all, but man, I did not want to go to the doctors after this. And so you sort of fall in, and then when you're in that dark room 402, which has again that wonderful surreal touch of like the water above them. But either I think it's in that moment where they're using the camera and then they're terrified and they're looking up, or maybe it's when the captain's alone. But that moment that all of a sudden our weapon of psychological distance is bringing us terrifyingly close. And so like the movie seems to be puncturing whatever psychological distance we might be able to gain. And this gets to my question I had for the person that spoke, and for you, Anthony, and for the class, but maybe starting with the person that spoke. In terms of this not a far jump from voyeur to victim, what did you make of that moment? Again, this movie's all about these overturnings. Do you remember when the captain's watching the footage and he's like, wait a second, there are 6 people in the room. Who's filming this shot? I'm curious. I'm sure everyone has thoughts, but to the person who spoke, how did you think that moment maybe spoke to this not a far jump from voyeur to victim line?
Any thought?
I think one of my thoughts is how, like, a lot of the comments in this room and everything were like very negative about the stream, right? They were like, it's really scary, what's going on, how like filming this. And it's this idea again of like creating more distance by making it seem more fake, I think, right? Like criticizing and like trying to create more distance and saying like, oh, this is all. I think what he was insinuating for the purposes of the stream was that this was all staged, right? This is all like fake and obviously. Whereas us having watched this in a perspective of found footage are like, no, there's something scary and creepy going on, something supernatural. And so it's almost like a protective defense, I think, for him to challenge that.
Another thought, Fareed, is that when, and again, taking this to the clinical realm, when somebody presents and you're considering that they're stricken or they're afflicted with a dissociative disorder, among the several criteria that you must reach is that reality testing continues to remain intact. Because if it doesn't, then you have to turn away from the dissociative disorders chapter of the DSM and go right to the schizophrenia spectrum and psychotic disorders chapter of the DSM. And that's the fine line. And there's emerging evidence in the literature that there's a lot of overlap. And at some point, there's going to be a single chapter that lists the psychotic disorders and dissociative disorders. We're getting there. Those 2 chapters will be merged in our future. We'll see that. But until then, the APA is maintaining this separation by this one criterion, and that is that reality testing remains intact. As we're dealing with different dissociative type of episodes and dissociative type experiences in this movie, when you do the head count and get an idea or draw the conclusion of who is holding that camera, might that be that breach from reality testing that as a clinician we were all waiting for this entire time? That allows us to kind of shift our conversation and include the psychotic disorders within our differential diagnosis.
If just for clarity's sake, Anthony, I'll be curious if anyone in the class has further thoughts on that reading. But just for clarity's sake, that moment. So that moment when the director, I loved how the person spoke, reminded us about this question of distance, creating more distance. What does that look like? I remember us being struck because the director no longer seemed to understand the very materiality of the film he was making. And he was just like, "Whoa, what is that?" And so I'm curious. Did you find that this moment? Because for me, I was struggling a lot, and maybe I'll be curious for everyone's thoughts about the presentation of possession. Where in psychiatric terms, when they go or whatever that freaky noise is. And then their eyes go white. Oh, excuse me, eyes go black. But there's this moment where when he says there's 6, is this a moment that signals his lucidity, that he hasn't fully gotten into that kind of schizophrenic state, or is this a moment that suggests that he's kind of crossing a threshold, and now that he is beginning to lose sense, that it's not that he's maintained lucidity, but rather he's beginning to find reality itself inscrutable? Could you clarify that his kind of psychic subject position there, Anthony?
Yeah, I mean, you could go either way with this. Do you have a thought?
I do think it's interesting because, like, from a lot of the movie, he is pretty detached as well, separating himself, kind of like creating this distance, trying to profit off this whole situation. And in that moment, there is like I think a sense of like reality testing that happens, and like maybe even lucidity, where it's kind of like a moment of, wait, if I'm reality testing, something must be really wrong here. Which I think people have in psychotic episodes where, like, toward the end, when they're kind of like maybe coming off a substance and they're kind of realizing some of the thoughts that they have don't really make that much sense after all.
Yep. Yeah, and I agree. So I think the easy answer to the question would be it depends on how you accept this film. If you accept it as a supernatural horror film, then his observation is that period of lucidity, that there are, who is that 6th person? And boy, this place is really haunted. However, if you maintain the perspective and view the film through a psychiatrist's lens, where unfortunately the supernatural is not an option, then his observation reveals that no, there's that breach in reality testing. And even though we may have been addressing his situation, his condition, as dissociative, now we must also consider his being psychotic. So it really does depend on what what frame of reference really you're coming from. Supernatural versus seen through that psychiatrist lens, and then depending on which A or B you choose, I think you can interpret that scene one way or the other.
Do you think, and Anthony, just to emphasize that, because as we're riffing on these great moments, if anyone in the room has any thoughts that are coming to mind or questions, I just invite them all to interrupt the conversation, because we want to hear your perspectives. But I'm curious, in that spirit, do you? And I love how you're reminding us that the film changes depending on how we read it, or from what maybe disciplinary vantage point, or even genre vantage point that we're looking at it. If we're thinking about it as a horror picture, that reality testing could be a sign of lucidity, like, aha, he's beginning to realize the true spookiness, on the one hand. If we're looking at it through a psychiatric lens, through your discipline, that moment of reality testing, rather than confirming genre tropes of the horror movie, rather it invites us to think like a kind of, it's almost nonsensical reality testing at that point. Like, wait, why would you, what does it mean about your psyche that you're seeing reality as a film you're no longer controlling? And again, what a wonderful articulation of that sense of distance and closeness and strangeness that the movie is. Remember, everyone, I'm very tempted to show the shot, but the moment the captain gets mad, excuse me, Anthony, I'm just going to run through the movie quickly while I'm talking, but I remember the moment the captain, maybe I forgive the ableist language there, mad, but when the captain begins to fully lose his bearings, I'm just looking at the scenes while I'm cycling and thinking, oh man, this is a freaky movie. But I remember at one point, and I don't think I'll be able to catch it, at least not now. But do you remember that kind of trope, Anthony, of like the split screen with 4 people, or 4 images? There's a moment when the captain is watching, where I'll have to just pantomime it for the people watching the camera. Hello. But like, do you remember there was all black except for one little square in the corner?
Right.
And like, I'm curious that like that all black except for one little square in the corner moment, if we can read it in different ways, in the horror way, the kind of the shadows are coming in, but at the same time, if we think about it in psychiatric terms, I'm wondering, before the screen promised a full view of reality, at least, I mean, a full view in terms of 4 angles. You had a sense of the space. By the time the captain begins to lose his psychological bearings, literally all he can see is one corner of the screen. And then I'm curious, is that another moment that we might be able to read, both in horror terms, the kind of the darkness encroaches, as well as in psychiatric terms, here is a person within a state of traumatic or psychological distress. He no longer has the same vantage point on the reality that he once had. How would we read that moment of the square in the corner, potentially to suggest something about how his worldview or his psychological stability is changing in this moment, Anthony?
Any thoughts? So I would go right along what you stated, Fareed, and that is that black screen is probably highly symbolic of his actually becoming psychotic. And I knew it's a loose association from this point on, but there are cognitive testing that is non-clinical, but certainly strong on the research side, where individuals with conditions such as schizophrenia are provided different structures and different shapes, and the processing of which is significantly different and below that of a control group. I don't know the specifics. Did anybody know anything about schizophrenia research? Because I know that there are some clinical terms or research terms that are put to this, and our division of schizophrenia research really focused on this particular topic. These neurocognitive tests, usually with functional MRI. And I just wonder, and it's just interesting that some of these shapes that individuals are asked and then track the reaction time to happen to look similar to that particular screenshot with that one square. What that would mean. So again, that is an incredibly loose association and clearly unintended by the writer-producer. But I think consistent with the symbolic nature of what that black screen represents is consistent with schizophrenia.
Do you find, I'm curious, like, and maybe this is maybe worth emphasizing to everyone while we're talking about this, Anthony, but I'm wondering, like, is it worth emphasizing? There are points where even when I was describing, like just setting up the movie a little bit with its history, where I said like the director notably did seed in like sounds of an impeachment trial or, something sort of audio references to the contemporary moment. And I remember the reason while we're talking, everyone, I'll just put up, I found an image with 4 squares that just to kind of help us remember a little bit now just imagine all of this, everyone, with most of the screen blacked out. But I would just want to maybe emphasize for people, and I think we all know this across our classes, but it's always sort of say like, once the text or the movie is out of the director's hands, it becomes a space. The director's intentionality is just one lens that we can look into a movie. So, when you're watching Gonjiam, you can bring a psychiatry lens and you can get a lot out of it. Or Fareed can bring much more of that Korean history stuff, as an example, stuff around cultural trauma rather than individual trauma, and get a lot out of it. Some the director may have intended and some they did not. So I would just maybe emphasize, as we're thinking about this picture and pictures in general, to really feel liberated when we're doing our own analysis and interpretation, because we're all bringing particular nexuses of lens, whether it's disciplinary, our own personal subject positions to these stories and to these forms. So I would just want to emphasize that in case people are wondering, like, what about the director's intent? Remember, Anthony, I've often had experiences where I've told directors my interpretations, and I would love to tell everyone with pride that they high-fived and low-fived me because I nailed it so much, like, yeah, you did it for me, and swing back around. But I have to admit, I've often met with furrowed brows, and they're like, And that's okay too. That just because the director furrow brows us doesn't mean that we don't have valuable things to say about the film. But with that said, I wanted to also ask, and maybe it's worth pausing for a moment, Anthony, and I have a few slides about documentary that I wanted to share with you if there was time, just to kind of get us thinking about what a found footage movie is doing in terms of our understanding of reality from a film studies perspective. Would that be useful, Anthony? Do we have time, or would you prefer just sharing our observations on the picture?
No, I think we both have time, and I think it would definitely be useful.
Okay, so I'll share.
Yeah.
So everyone, I'll briefly run through these things. I'll ask questions throughout. I'll seed questions, Anthony, and for time, I'll just wait until after my comments to see if anyone has any questions, responses to some of my questions I'm posing, or potentially answers. But now that we've had a psychiatry perspective, which has been so valuable, I just want to share a little bit from documentary studies about what's happening in this movie, and also maybe bringing in someone who the humanities have definitely taken and ran with, bringing one of your compatriots, Freud, in via the uncanny. But I want to just quickly note, so I'll introduce Gonjiam very briefly. No, I'll have a note on the mockumentary and the uncanny, and I have some questions, many of which we've already answered. But I just wanted to give us, since I noticed you were going about what reality means, I think it'd be worthwhile to think about how the mockumentary allows us to understand, the way in which documentary is itself a construction, and what that suggests about authenticity and how we believe what we see. Remember, this movie is so oftentimes, this is the only movie I've seen, Anthony, that has like YouTube like act breaks or like ad breaks where they're like horror times, and then it reminds you, oh wait, I've been watching a YouTube video this whole time, or at least some of the time. But I would just note, like, so for those who want to know, like this, as Anthony noted, found footage as a vehicle for a particular empathy, for that line between voyeur and victim to be fully exposed, and also victimizer, because I think found footage makes us voyeur as victimizer, makes us kind of aware of our own bloodthirstiness. So it was a grand success. First attempt in South Korea, combining this found footage technique with the setting of YouTube live streaming. And as we saw, the movie opens with two high school boys who go missing after exploring the abandoned Gonjiam psychiatric hospital. The director noted the following, Bong Shik-jung, Chu Ji-young's question, what was the inspiration for this film? People posting on Instagram, Snapchat, and Twitter are experiencing things to the fullest. The producer approached me with an idea on the Gonjiam psychiatric hospital. CNN had called it one of the 7 scariest places on earth. Note the reality here, we do see that list. Because this was going to be Korea's first found footage film, I wanted the audience to access it easily through the narrative and visuals. At the same time, I wanted to use classical techniques that create fear and suspense. So as I'm talking, what did you all notice about the form? How was fear being constructed? How was suspense being constructed? So the film starts out with a narrative that the viewer can easily follow, but throughout the film, especially towards the end, I use those cinematic techniques or tactics to build horror and suspense. While using YouTube live streaming as a setting for a film, I attempted to move away from patterns seen in previous horror films. I know over Night's Watch, we've seen a lot of classic horror films. How are you all seeing the way in which the patterns of horror films are being disrupted, even by bringing it into this YouTube vein? For example, the viewer might expect a ghost to appear at one point or another. I wanted to confuse the audience and keep them guessing. How did you all experience this confusion? Like, did the formal confusion lead to a further sense of psychological confusion? Did it help you or encourage you to lose your bearings as a viewer? And I wanted to just emphasize, when we're thinking about mockumentary, to think about, like, how does the mockumentary demonstrate and challenge the principles of documentary? Grierson, notably, Anthony, describes this for those who are interested. But this was in response on a great article on the mockumentaries. The scholar writes, fake documentaries do and undo the documentary form, the film subject, and the moral and social orders. Look at the way in which the fake documentary is a mode of social critique and political critique. They are formally rich, as well as uniquely situated to reveal the certainties, as well as the lies about history, identity, and truth that have sustained both documentary and the world it records. Fake documentaries imply, sometimes state, and often critique the crucial relations between documentary and the textual and actual authority it assumes, reflects, and constructs. Remember, everyone, this whole film seems to be about the downfall of the director. or the downfall of the captain. This end up maybe in the service of a good laugh at authority. Mockumentaries maybe are usually kind of seen as like, this is Spinal Tap, but it as often serves as a serious critique of power. As I mentioned, remember the movie repeatedly evokes military dictatorship and cultural trauma. How do you all understand the way in which this found footage movie, this mockumentary, is giving a mockumentary view of history, using the mockumentary form to think about some of the taboo history, both recent and past? And this was actually, this line, Anthony, everyone, was about District 9. So writing about District 9, a scholar named Heller, which is a sci-fi horror movie, sci-fi mockumentary set in apartheid, in South Africa, or post-apartheid South Africa. A productive fake documentary produces uncertainty and also knowingness about documentary's codes, assumptions, and processes. The fakery of fake docs mirrors and reveals the sustaining lies of all documentary, both real and fake, producing the possibility for the contesting of identity, history, identity, and truth. How do you see the film critiquing documentary and its authority? How, to put it in Freudian terms, is this an uncanny documentary? How does this reveal, how does this defamiliarize, in the same way that Charlotte helped defamiliarize a sense of Korean history, and maybe the way in which Charlotte herself was defamiliarized in a sense of knowing where she was at. So we have Gonjiam as cultural trauma, as I mentioned. I'll just briefly highlight things like the uncanny, which is the class of the terrifying, which leads back to something long known to us, once very familiar. And this essay on the uncanny, which is one of my favorites of Freud, noted a bunch of aspects of the uncanny and quotes, "One of the most uncanny and widespread forms of superstition is the dread of the evil eye." So given all of this, everyone, how do we see the elements of the uncanny in Gonjiam? And I think specifically for this moment of evil eye, two moments come to mind. I mean, there's a lot of, kind of evil eyes sense, but I do think, number one, who is shooting this? And also, I think the way in which that suggests the evil eye is very much linked to the documentary, to the person who would want the story at any cost. So the evil eye, that comes out in that moment, potentially. Maybe there are other moments. Remember, this is a movie that is all about the eye turning black. So we have the uncanny, the captain's split. When we've talked about that, I'd be curious, how other elements of the uncanny do we see? Remember when they're at the coffee shop, everyone, at the beginning of the movie, and they're having, I think, the funnest time that's ever been put to screen. When we see that, we're seeing some notable English text. Like at one point, I think it says "No Stress Cafe," and like, this moment here is reminding us of a kind of sense of safety and familiarity, and then by the end, taking it all away from us. So I think, as we're thinking about these features, and everyone, I'll hold for a moment, since I've given you, Anthony, and the class a blunderbuss of observations, but I just couldn't resist sharing it all with you. But as we go to sort of throw back to those watching, I just wanted to highlight, that there are several moments that the text on screen, and this is how we should read movies, everyone. We should read them just for our own entertainment and edification, go deep into the image. And so what do we do at the beginning of the film that we have a no stress cafe, and yet we then fall into stress hospital? What is this movie suggesting about the familiar before taking it away from us? And so you'll see a lot of my questions beyond the ones I made about authenticity, documentary, the mockumentary, critique, and the uncanny. Many of them were already touched upon. How do we understand the split experience of trauma in the movie, where some experience horror and some are casually working on the door? How do you understand the various visuals of the film, VR, GoPro, drones? How do you understand, and I would appreciate in psychiatric terms, the breakdown of the cameras, as when the drones fall? What about the crossing of the threshold? If we are at No Stress Cafe, I think we could have originally called the tent No Stress Camp. So what about the crossing of the threshold moment, when the fire burns in the security of the camp, the burners? We've already talked about the bloodthirstiness of the crowd and how the numbers seem to go up. but I would ask maybe psychologically or psychiatrically, in psychiatric terms, how do you understand the possession going on? The moments when people are overtaken and you have that sense of, eyes going black and a bloop, 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 whatever. Is it tongues? I don't know what, it's terrifying, but I don't know what medically what that might associate with. And what do we make of that moment when one of the people, we see him scream in terror as he's turned? Everyone else usually just cuts to like, or just sort of changes and becomes like monstrous or possessed. There's one of them when the face is grabbed and his eyes go black, he is screaming in fear. How is that possession different from the other, and that may be violation, than the other kinds of possession we see? So Anthony, the class, those are just some of my thoughts that on this, and some general frameworks to understand mockumentary and to understand how I was looking at it through a very loose psychoanalytic term via the uncanny. I'll be curious, does anyone have any thoughts, questions, or hopefully any answers to any of the many questions I've just posed you?
I have a couple of thoughts. I want to put it to the table first, though.
Please.
One thing with the camera that came to mind was like the different layers of oneself, right? Like the ego and super ego and all these cameras, like in different aspects of the picture. And as the cameras kind of go off, it's almost like you're losing a part of yourself. And I think sometimes like the lack of self-awareness that is not always there in psychotic disorders. It's often symptomatic of psychotic disorders. So that was one thought I had.
So the comment primarily focuses on the topography of the Freudian unconscious or subconscious with the id, the ego, and the superego, and what the different camera shots or angles really represents. And as they black out, is that a metaphor for those components of oneself also being lost? You also made a comment about the evil eye, and you posed it in the form of a question in terms of what goes into understanding the evil eye in this movie, in the context of when it happens, etc. I will add that where it happens is also fundamentally important. And the reason why is because the evil eye is actually a psychiatric diagnosis. So I'm going to be the very rigid evil eye that is classified as a culturally sanctioned belief, which differentiates from a culturally bound syndrome. In each case, whether you talk about the syndrome versus the belief, you have something that is geographically isolated, at least on tests. In one situation, the culturally bound syndrome, even in its isolation, even in its geographical locale, its culture, it's considered to be abnormal. On the other hand, contrary to that, the culturally sanctioned belief is also geographically isolated, but in that isolated culture, it's normative behavior, and that's the evil eye. Right? The evil eye is considered to be completely normal if it exists in the culture that is primarily focused on Eastern Asia and Europe, right? So if somebody were to come in and say, listen, I don't think I've ever seen this movie before. I've never seen Gonjiam before. However, and then gives you information about the evil eye. One of the first questions I would need answered includes where you're from, generationally, what's believed in your home. Because if, again, where this takes place is of ultimate importance, because in one situation, I will reassure the individual that what you're experiencing, i.e. the evil eye, is completely normal. It's normative. It's sanctioned. Versus being from outside of that culture and not having that fundamental understanding where I'd be more concerned that there was something else going on. So that's the general idea. And at least my perspective with regard to the evil eye, not only who it happens to, not only when it happens, but I think even more importantly, where it happens is fundamental to the understanding of the role the evil eye plays, not only in this movie, but in clinical psychiatry and psychology. And then we could get into what machinations of this could have actually been demonstrated if Charlotte had experienced the evil eye versus a non-Charlotte character in that hospital on that continent. So that was one idea I had. And then it kind of related to it. I mean, the evil eye certainly hallmarks possession. And this too, as of 2013, in the revision to the DSM-5, is a clinical term. So the P word actually does exist in the DSM.
Oh, wow.
It actually does. So that is the APA, in describing a condition called dissociative identity disorder, when a distinct personality state takes over one's conscious awareness. In certain cultures, that personality state can be experienced as possession. So we often think of Eve and M. Night Shyamalan's Split, and you could fill in any other movie fictional account here. But now every film with spirit or demonic possession also counts, and that includes this film.
I was wondering, I love all of this. This is why I don't know how everyone else is feeling in our virtual room and in the in-person room, but I love Gonjiam, and now Anthony and your as well as the class's your commentaries are making me love this movie all the more. I'm just like, what a fascinating picture. And so I was curious though, Anthony, like, and and I know we are running out of time, but first I'll just throw out, this is a very poor screen capture, my apologies, but this is the first time I think we see an evil eye in the movie. Do you remember? It's when the camera pans with the high school boys and the camera pans backwards, from the darkness back to them, we see the eyes, and then the movie sort of slows down that. So I have this question in terms of this kind of, and I love, it's very uncanny what you're describing, even like, from the psychiatric diagnosis versus the culturally sanctioned belief, this notion of if it's in the culture, yeah, sure, East Asia, you're fine. Outside the culture, I'm curious, Anthony, do you have any thoughts on the very fact that YouTube is itself, because this is being projected globally, ostensibly, and like, does this in some ways create a framework? Does the YouTube create a framework to understand these kind of evil eyes within a more abnormal lens, because of the way it's taking something culturally and geographically specific and broadcasting them globally?
Yeah, and the answer is yes. And this is something that we struggle with in clinical psychiatry right now, because, obviously the news is good, multiculturalism. It used to be so easy that on a test, you just realize that the person is from X country and it's experiencing X signs and symptoms. And I remember that. That's called, and then you can put diagnostic label here, choice A, and move on for your exam. In clinical medicine in 2023, that becomes a lot more difficult, because there's no such thing as geographical isolation anymore. Right? And a person could actually be in the South Pole for the last 30 years, but if they've been on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, they certainly can adopt aspects of cultures outside of Antarctica, right? So that's just the unfortunate nature of the unsimplifying, diagnosing within the context of these conditions or disorders. So it still works on a shelf exam, because we could paint a real neat depiction of what's going on to test your knowledge, test your fund of knowledge. But the applicability in clinical medicine is very, very poor in 2023.
I think too, like the thing with YouTube and other media like that, is it actually like creates more challenges in reality testing and in what's real and what's not, right? Because things are edited, things are changed. And so now the lawyer also is tasked of having to test and figure out, like,
good point,
is this real or is this edited?
right? Right. And it's easy to split and realize I'm never going to listen to any news that comes over YouTube or TikTok or X/Twitter/X, or not, or that's where I get all my news from. It's very easy to split. It's very difficult to remain in that gray and realize some of the news over these platforms is true, some of them is fake news, and I'll take it on a proverbial case-by-case basis. That's much, much more difficult, and quite frankly, I think overwhelms a lot of people.
No, I so appreciate this point, and I would emphasize, that we see Charlotte and one of the other women, I mean, again, because these are global subjects, these are transnational subjects, like we all are, to everyone's point. But when they go coming soon, like they actually say coming soon, and they're evoking Hollywood, they're speaking multiculturally, bilingually. And to your point, like this creates this very interesting and difficult stew, I think, as we're teasing out the allegory in terms of like as a humanities film scholars, what's happening? And as we're also kind of thinking about diagnosis, like wait, and I think that's part of the joy of such films is that it isn't a step exam. It can be muddled, you know, and it can be imperfect, and it can create some interesting frameworks. Anthony, thank you so much for this wonderful time. I hope everyone enjoyed themselves.
I think we're good here. Thank you so much for your time.
It was a
Well,
real blast. I'm spinning in my chair, everyone, from excitement. I'm gonna spin after I go off camera. I'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.